I do not hide the fact that I am a Christian. I go to church every week, I attend Bible study groups, and even tithe, mostly because I have run out of reasons not to. So it bewilders everyone who knows me when I tell them that I cannot stand the film God's Not Dead. Where to begin with this mind wreck of a train screw? The arguments made by the protagonist are about as pathetic as the straw man arguments made by Kevin Sorbo's character. There's a number of subplots that go absolutely nowhere, the protagonist is unlikable, and these two never get to Disney World. Okay, if we're doing this, and we are doing this, we need to start by addressing two important details. First, the point of this film was to teach teenagers and college students how to respond to professors who challenge their faith in this way. And while most of them are not as direct as Professor Radisson, those challenges do exist. The purpose of this film was not necessarily to convert atheists to Christianity, and so we're going to overlook the fact that this film makes more convincing arguments for atheism than it does for Christianity. And second, the flaws of this film do need to be weighed against the reality of what students can actually encounter in Western universities. And regarding that, we need to address the Hollywood atheist problem. A straw man argument is a deliberately weak argument that a character makes so that a character the author actually supports can take it apart. But what Christian movies have a habit of doing with atheists goes beyond making a deliberately weak argument. The Hollywood atheist is more of a poor representation of an entire lifestyle, usually including things like a smug sense of superiority over religious people, a general hatred towards Christians in particular, and a strong desire for hedonism, usually the kind that most religions would criticize. In real life, most atheists don't care about religion enough to tell their friends and family about it. If you're a Christian, or really anything other than an atheist, there's a good chance that there are people in your social circles who are atheists, and you don't even know it. I can't prove it, but I suspect that around 80% of atheists are like this. However, there is that minority group of atheists who actually do live up to the archetype of the Hollywood atheist. And this is a problem that's less of an issue of the film, and more an issue with atheism in general. Because most atheists are utterly silent about their lack of beliefs, the bulk of people Christians and other religious people can identify as atheists will be people like Professor Radisson. What's more is that, going back to our first rule for analyzing this film, there's really no point in training young Christians on how to defend their faith from atheists who never mention the subject. And going back to the second rule, atheists like Professor Radisson do exist, and do seem to gravitate towards university positions. I have had a professor declare himself to be a god on the first day of class. I've had many demand that all their students agree to things that violate their personal beliefs, and even had one professor declare that Christians should be labeled a terrorist group because they got Trump elected. So it's not unreasonable to make films about this sort of thing to teach students how to stand up to bad professors. Now, I can already hear someone typing in the comments section, but what about cases where Christians mistreat atheists? Go make your own movie about how to deal with that. The existence of abuse in both directions doesn't mean one party shouldn't make a video on how to protect themselves from the other. The next thing I want to talk about is the very idea of the slogan, God is dead. Many people have complained about Radisson not understanding what Nietzsche meant, and while I would like to give PureFlix Entertainment the benefit of the doubt, I don't think they have any idea what Nietzsche was talking about either. This brings me to one of the few accidentally great points in the film, and part of the reason I'm doing this review 9 years after the movie came out, because one of the few salvageable parts of this film is the fact that Radisson has no idea what he's talking about. This is what frustrates me so much about this film. It's like a rich man went into a fancy hotel, ate an expensive dinner with a solid gold garnish, and this movie is the turd he left behind. If it was solid waste all the way through, I could ignore it and move on, but because there are actually a few valuable flakes in it, I'm panning for gold in the middle of a sewer trying to recover anything of artistic merit. And one of those flakes is the fact that the professor has the power to destroy his students academically, threatens and bullies them into going along with his lesson plan, and he's objectively wrong about his own subject material. Some of the biggest idiots that I have ever met were tenured professors. And it doesn't really matter if they're dumb, or haven't read their own subject matter, or have turned their classrooms into a platform to preach their own nonsensical ideas. Even the part where Professor Radisson physically threatens Josh is all too real for some kids in college. Yes, on paper, Professor Radisson should have been fired for half the things he did in this film. But rules like that only matter if they're enforced, and as many parents discovered from remote learning during the lockdowns, high schools and colleges were allowing teachers to get away with all sorts of bad behavior. And so here is one of the biggest positive messages that the movie almost got right, and it's one that everyone, including atheists, could have learned from. Rules only matter if they are enforced, and students don't have a lot of power over their professors to hold them to the rules. But there's one exception. Every authority figure, whether it's a teacher, a tenured professor, or any other person in a position of power, hates being humiliated in front of the people over whom they hold authority. For a professor, that's their students, and one of the few checks and balances students have over a professor like Radisson is to make his students lose respect for him by showing how incompetent he is, by showing that he did not get to his position through merit, that he does not deserve the authority that he has. This is a corrupt authority figure's kryptonite. Unfortunately, the film never follows through with this, at least not intentionally. They swung a hammer around in the dark and managed to hit the nail once or twice, but they never built anything with it. To that end, I would like you to spend the rest of this review examining Professor Radisson not as a poorly constructed example of an atheist, but as a professor trying to force his students to accept a position they don't agree with. It could be anything. If you want to go with stuff that professors have actually been teaching in college, it can be the belief that everyone born with a certain skin color is evil, or that certain groups of people need to be rounded up and put in jail. If that doesn't work for you, imagine Professor Radisson, but as a Christian trying to force his students to accept his religion under the threat of failing his class if they don't. Then you might have an easier time understanding why I hate this film. Because the biggest problem with this movie isn't Radisson, it's Josh. You know, the guy who's supposed to be the hero of the film? Yeah, they forgot to make him heroic. Josh begins the film all right, responding as an underdog to the conflict he's presented with, but towards the end of the debate, he flat out weaponizes Radisson's own trauma against him and loses his temper mid-debate. Now that might be normal for an 18-year-old to do. It's possible that he has neither the maturity nor the debating experience to resist an easy win against a guy who hasn't been playing fair since day one. But from a writing perspective, this is terrible, even if it is realistic. It makes your audience come away thinking both of these characters are dishonest people, because they kinda are. And what's really upsetting about the final scene of the debate, in which Josh decides to exploit Radisson's grief over his mother's death, is that it contains another golden nugget of this film. The part where Josh calls Radisson out on the fact that the position he's taking isn't in support of philosophy, or even atheism anymore, it's anti-theism. The reason this is so important is because it pulls the mask off of Radisson's stance as a Hollywood atheist, and reveals that he isn't an atheist at all. Had the film addressed this, in more than a single line from Josh in just this one scene, it would wipe away most of the problems that come from his poor portrayal of atheists, mostly by clarifying that he isn't an atheist. An easy way to fix this would be to have any character in this classroom besides Josh identify this fact. Most of these students are little more than scenery for the majority of the film, but having one or two show any signs of intelligence would have given the film the opportunity to flesh them out a bit more, and in doing so avoid the pitfalls of making so many strawman arguments. More importantly, showing that Josh isn't the only Christian in the room, but that the others are just bowing their heads and going along with Radisson, would open up an opportunity to fix another major problem with this film. The question of what would have happened if Josh had just wrote out the three-word slogan on day one. By the end of the film, Radisson is dead, he doesn't get to reconcile with Mina, Josh's girlfriend breaks up with him, the entire class hasn't gotten to learn anything about philosophy, a bunch of completely unrelated plots that feel like they were cut from two completely different movies end in someone dying of cancer and a Muslim father throwing his daughter out on the street, and these two still never make it to Disney World. All of this, except for maybe the subplots, could have been averted if Josh had simply complied with Radisson's orders on the first day of class. So you could be forgiven if you thought that Josh should have just gone along with the rest of the class in the very beginning of the film. The problem with this is that we are never shown what would have happened if Josh had kept his peace. We're never shown what happens to you if you keep your head down in the face of a bullying professor like Radisson. A person with more experience might know what happens when you give in to peer pressure like this. I mentioned before that this film has been somewhat vindicated by the lockdowns of 2020, and parents learning what professors and even school teachers were forcing their students to adopt as doctrine. A professor demanding that all students denounce God is tame compared to some of these things. I am not asking this film to show students condemned to hell for going along with Radisson. In fact, any consequences that we have to imagine in an afterlife based on a Bible verse that many people disagree on anyways is a really poor way to make your case. You need to rely on things that we can actually verify, and that means nothing that happens beyond the grave. What the film could have done was show us some of the older students who went along with Radisson's lesson plan, and show how caving to authority figures like this has made their lives worse. I'll admit that this is easier to do now than it was in 2014, with examples abound of students who accepted whatever their teachers told them was true, and how their lives have become an absolute hell on earth now as a result. But this brings up a major flaw with Christian education in general, namely, how to deal with an authority figure who abuses their position. Christianity teaches people to respect both their elders and their authority figures, on the grounds that they've been placed there by God and thus should be obeyed. The exception to this is when the authority figure is telling you to do something that goes against God. And what do we define as something that goes against God? Don't ask your average parochial school student because his teachers probably haven't told him. Okay, obviously demanding that everyone denounce God on the first day of class is a clear example, and it's understandable that Josh wouldn't go along with that. But the unfortunate fact about any kid who went to a parochial school until college is that they've probably been sheltered. And I don't mean that in the way that people trying to criticize a Christian education normally mean sheltered. I went to a parochial school from kindergarten to 8th grade, and the thing is, when the faculty are doing everything right, and there are no bad actors, you don't get to see what a corrupt or crooked authority figure looks like. You aren't exposed to that kind of evil, and cartoons and video games aren't really going to prepare you for what you will face as soon as you leave and go to public school. And even if the teachers aren't always on their best behavior, they'll tell you to follow the commandment about honoring authority figures and do what they say anyway. But then, one day, you graduate from your Christian school and have to enter the real world in the form of public education. First, you stop going to the school in the building that looks like an elongated church and start going to the one that looks like a prison. There is a reason for this. And then, you first get acquainted with the public school system, where you might meet a gym teacher that puts Kamoshida to shame. You might find a teacher who despises you and docks your grades purely because you were born male or female. You might have an advanced English teacher who hates everyone who isn't as fat and stupid as she is, which means she hates everyone equally. You might get your first taste of violent racism. You might even turn to the campus police liaison for help with some of these problems, only to find that he's too drunk or too stoned to do anything. This film could have addressed this, but it didn't. It could have shown that Josh doesn't go above Radisson's head or get a senior authority involved purely because he doesn't know he can. It could have shown Josh going to the campus authorities to complain, and then show how the college is too disinterested or corrupt to take the issue seriously. They could have even shown how going through the proper channels to stop a teacher from abusing his position can backfire when the teacher finds out about it and retaliates. But it never shows any of this. One thing that the film does get somewhat close to teaching is the issue of a debate without rules. In the scenes where Josh is making his case for God, really a case for agnosticism because he's not really trying to prove God exists, but rather that we can't prove he doesn't, Professor Radisson uses pretty much every forbidden tactic in a structured debate. This includes springing arguments on Josh by surprise, such as Stephen Hawking's theory on a self-creating universe, which Josh couldn't have prepared an answer for because he can't be expected to prepare for every possible claim his opponents might make. Radisson also tries name-dropping historical figures like Shakespeare or the then-still-living Hawking to make his point, and declares Josh to be arrogant to think he's smarter than either of these people. These kinds of ad hominem attacks are also illegal in debates, but there's a funny thing that this film does manage to show. None of the rules matter. It's very possible that none of the students in the class know anything about the rules of a debate. There is no moderator, no one is explaining any of the standard rules to the class, and it's perfectly believable that these students would go along with these underhanded tactics because, in real life, rules don't exist. In the real world, most of the debates you find yourself in aren't going to have a moderator or any set of rules. Most people you argue with aren't going to be lawyers, a lot of them aren't smart enough to know why their debate tactics are illegal, and there won't be any way to enforce any fair play rules against a rule breaker. And it's perfectly valid for the film to show Radisson arguing this way, and to show the students who don't know any better being swayed by these tactics, because that's how it will often be in real life. What is not okay is having Josh turn around and use some of these same tactics, or suggesting to students that it's acceptable to respond to underhandedness with more underhandedness. To a degree, fighting against an opponent who name-drops a famous smart person by pointing out that other famous smart people don't agree with him is perfectly fine. Sometimes the only counter to an underhand debate tactic is to throw it back at your opponent, as it can show the audience what's wrong with it. But if you're going to explain that restating nonsensical claims doesn't change anything, and then you're going to say, Hawking wasn't wrong but his logic was faulty, you'd better make certain you explain the difference between wrong conclusions and faulty logic, or the class in-universe and your film's audience will have good reason to think your character is being a hypocrite. But by far, the worst thing that Josh does in this film, to the point that I will personally call you out if I find you promoting this sort of behavior in your own works, is taking advantage of Radisson's grief and trauma over losing his mother to cancer to win the debate. It's one thing to have a person like Radisson raise the issue and challenge you to explain why a loving deity would ever allow things like this to happen. Then it's fair game to answer the opposition's question. But there's no reason to be a jerk about it. And this brings me to another problem I have with the debate. In trying to turn Radisson into a caricature of an atheist, the film allows him to inadvertently bring up a good point regarding cancer, effectively raising up the problem of evil, one of the strongest arguments against the existence of the Christian God. Josh doesn't really address this beyond free will, and here's why I said earlier that the film actually makes a better case against Christianity than for it. Now, there are plenty of arguments that Josh could have made to counter Radisson's point. I'm not going to go into too many details because this video is long enough already, but Josh could have brought up Thomas Aquinas' arguments regarding the problem of evil. He could have brought up the idea that suffering is necessary for humans to grow. He could have made the case that to a Christian and to God, dying young from cancer is the same as calling someone home sooner rather than later, and when a human has finished everything that God wants them to do on earth, sometimes he calls them home sooner rather than waiting for them to spend another 30 or 40 years in this insane asylum we call life. Perhaps the best philosopher to address this issue is Orc Smart Boy Finky Pants, over on Noman's channel, who put it like this: well, then you're dead, and you ain't got no problem no more. We can respond to this by either accepting it and growing from it, or rejecting it and suffer as Radisson did in the film, a film which brings up none of these arguments against the problem of evil. And what's really frustrating about this is that the film has 3 other movies running in the background for seemingly no reason, which take up time that could have been spent on the main point of the movie. We could drop the entire subplot about the reporter and her boyfriend, or Aisha converting to Christianity, and were the guys from Duck Dynasty supposed to add star power to this film or something? What if we cut some of these unrelated subplots and make them into their own movies, and then spend more time addressing the actual problems of the debate? The point of this film, as I stated earlier, was to teach Christian students going out into college for the first time what to do when they encounter problems like this, and it failed, miserably. If I were a Christian-hating college professor, this is exactly the film that I would want my students to watch before taking my class, so that they'd be completely unprepared for the tricks real crooks with authority have up their sleeves. Any student who isn't a Christian, but also doesn't know what to do when they encounter authority figures like this, can't learn much of anything from this film either. This is why I consider the movie a failure. The movie had all the pieces necessary to make a good story, and even include some important messages like how to stand up to these kinds of authority figures, and how to identify which rules matter and to whom they're applied. But it failed to accurately assemble or deliver any of these things. So I bring this film up now, almost 9 years after it first aired in theaters, because I want people who are thinking of writing stories like this to learn from these mistakes. And to that end, let's recap. Number 1. Make a decision whether you want your antagonist to present a particular argument or a particular kind of arguer. If you want him to present an argument, don't make him a straw man. If you want him to be a warning against argumentative people who use their power and authority to make up for the fact that their arguments aren't very good, commit to the bit and lean into it. Make it a story about how a student or teenager deals with an abusive authority figure. Number 2. If you're going to show your antagonist doing illegal things like threatening students, explore why he can get away with these things, and why the system allows or even condones it. Show why your protagonist doesn't turn to a higher authority to solve the problem that way, or how it can make the problem worse. Number 3. Don't have multiple unrelated subplots that look like footage from a completely different movie. The clearest writing derives from simplicity. Split separate plots into separate films. Create your own cinematic universe if you have to. Number 4. Either learn the rules of a debate and make it clear to the audience what those rules are, or make it clear that the normal, polite rules don't apply to the debate in question. You can go either way, but you have to pick one. Number 5. If your antagonist either intentionally or unintentionally brings up a good point, be certain that your protagonist actually addresses that point. Don't just leave it hanging like a loose thread. In conclusion, this movie is terrible. There are so many other things wrong with this film that I just don't have time to discuss. The short version? Don't imitate anything from this film, whether it's the characterization, or the execution, or having people from Duck Dynasty finding out about this debate on the news and not seeing the police get involved. I'll let the portrayal of the Muslim family slide because Marco Khan, the actor who played the Muslim dad, is an Iranian immigrant who played a heavy role in revising those scenes to be more accurate. So I'll give that issue the benefit of the doubt. But it still had nothing to do with the rest of the film. And don't ask me to give this film a review score. The only reason I would ever recommend watching this film is to see what you should not do in making a movie. But if that's actually something you want to do, then it actually is worth checking out. So, when you make a film that wants to criticize a particular point of view, try to be respectful. That doesn't mean you don't recognize that some people are just plain evil, but those aren't the people you're probably trying to convince. And if you'd like to read a story that doesn't treat everyone who isn't a Christian like a cartoon villain, check out Heroes of Janan, The Science of Magic over on Amazon. Share this video, hit that like and subscribe button, and keep on writing. Bye!